All right. Thank you very much for sharing the last 20 minutes of your expo day. I was worried that it was going to be me and my friend Maddie over here. I'm just going to be talking to my own team. If you don't mind, Maddie's going to take a quick walk back and forth. We got to scan your badges. That's part of the thing that we do. If you want to find out more about what we're going to talk about, because this is a 20-minute session, and it's hard to go super deep technical. However, I'm happy to continue the conversation. I know we're closing up in 20 minutes for the booth, but you can come by. I'll give you access to me. My Twitter handle's there, so you can actually find me anytime. So I encourage you to do so. What we're going to talk about is deploying Kubernetes at scale on AWS. I should give you, so I'm the technology evangelist. I also I'm the director of technical marketing at Turbonomic. I've been working in the industry in financial services as systems architect for many years. I'm in the Kubernetes ecosystem. I'm a contributor. I even supported OpenStack. Maybe that didn't work out, but hey, Kubernetes is going to hang on. So we're going to talk about why architectural decisions will come into play and why when you look at scale on AWS, you have to think about those things. So when we talk about building for scale, scale is going to be different based on whoever you are and what your requirements are. And so this can vary based on what your current needs are and your future. So why build for scale now? It's important because you have to think about decisions you make architecturally today may define constraints that you're going to get bound by in the course of the next while. Now, a simple thing of mapping architecture to requirements as technologists. So here is like operating Kubernetes infrastructure in some form today. Excellent. And who has no idea what Kubernetes is, and you're just grabbing a seat because you're tired? Okay, good. We got one. I like the honesty there. When we look at different ways that you're going to embrace Kubernetes, we heard about Fargate being brought over for Fargate for EKS. So really cool, right? Amazing thing. In fact, one of the slides I've got, because I didn't have that information before I wrote my slides, you'll see 3 columns. There should be 4, and I'll talk about that in a second. Container configuration and specs. Right, when we do container configuration specifications, why do we do it and how do we do it and how is it going to impact your overall architecture? When and what should you scale in order to assure the performance of things that are running on Kubernetes? And we can talk about how Kubernetes is it scaling because you'll see kind of the neat things. And I will talk about what Turbonomic does kind of at the very end. So I'll show you literally there's like 48 seconds about Turbonomic. The rest is about Kubernetes because I think that's more important. And ultimately, that's the full stack application resource management. So I encourage you, you can come over. I'm over at booth 1029. We got a big, you can actually see us from here. And tomorrow at 4 o'clock, I'm giving away a giant $800 Lego Millennium Falcon. So do come by and you can win that one. So let's talk about why you want to build for scale now. Building for scale is going to matter to different environments in different ways. It may mean that you need to scale just to be able to run 100 workloads. It may mean 1,000. It may mean 17 clusters. It may mean disparate environments across different geos. So when we think about it, you really want to look at not just in the true scaling of where things live, but there's a lot of different factors that come in when you talk about Kubernetes and architecture that you may not see when you're thinking about just raw Kubernetes as like technology. How are you going to handle identity and access management? Are you using role-based access control? What's the version of Kubernetes you're running? Are you going to run vanilla DIY or enroll your own, or are you going to use like a Fargate or an EKS? I'm seeing that dominantly in the environments that I'm working with today, that EKS has been the de facto winner because it just works, it scales as you need it, and it gives you the ability to kind of let Amazon kind of handle the stuff that you don't really want to deal with because it's neat that we can. We're amazing, smart engineers, but let's think about these things, like how do you deal with networking and storage and namespace limitations. Namespace is a really funny thing because as you deploy and scale out, you may find actual boundaries within Kubernetes itself that you didn't realize were there. And then tracing and observability, so you deploy all this stuff out there. How do you understand what the performance is? How do you understand how the applications are behaving? And things like security, obviously, capacity and performance. So obviously, I've got a bit of a lean towards what I can solve on capacity and performance, but as an architect and a peer in the environment, I have a more vested interest in all of these things. We have to look at all of those things and everything we do in architecture to think about mapping it to business requirements. So plain and simple, have you ever heard of, they call it ampers or ramps if you're looking at TOGAF type of framework or different types of like high-level architectures. AMP is availability, manageability, performance, recoverability, and security. So availability, making sure that you can have continuously available applications and infrastructure. So making sure when you look at your distribution of workloads, your distribution of networking, can you ensure that wherever you drop that pod, that it's going to do the things you need it to do? It has the firewalls, it has the networking, has the storage. Storage, one of the biggest problems that we find that people underestimate the impact of when you're looking at Kubernetes. Manageability. What's going to be easier for your team? Like, do you want to be doing 80% of your day just figuring out how to keep Kubernetes alive and well? Or do you actually want to think higher level and handle? So looking at the choice of EKS versus roll your own, that's going to come into play. Performance. So defining SLOs and SLAs today, how do you define your service level objectives and service level agreements for your applications in the environment right now? Mostly it's just like, I sure hope it hits 80%. Or I hope it stays up, and then if it goes down, someone will call, right? So making sure that you're aware of that so that you know when you're on the wrong side of those boundaries. And then even the underlying infrastructure. Oops, sorry. And then recoverability. Well, we've always been told that Kubernetes just runs nothing but non-persistent cattle workloads. Shoot them, it doesn't matter, they can go away. I'm real and honest, right? Some people call it legacy, I call it production. You will have long-running workloads in Kubernetes that are sitting in containers but acting like virtual machines potentially. They may be monoliths. There's actually nothing wrong with that, because in order to re-architect or refactor an application, most companies that I've found are successful in it actually put it in the environment first. Then they break it out, because now you're working in the right type of infrastructure overlay. So you know you're dealing with real namespaces, with real things like service mesh. Those things now are in place instead of you having to go on a whiteboard, write how it should go, and then you deploy it over there and you find out that some stuff just doesn't look like it did on the whiteboard. And then, of course, recoverability, again, like I said, it's how do you back up those workloads? Then the next stage, of course, is security. I know, as everybody do, security is first on your mind, right? You always think, I won't deploy anything unless it's completely secure. All right, I like your honesty. That's true, right? It's tough because obviously we have things like IAM, we've got RBAC, we've got all the things around getting in. So authentication, authorization. There's actually not that much inside Kubernetes itself. So then it's application tier, it's network tier. So you really have to think about all of these things as you look at when you want to scale out. Like I said, do you need to use service mesh? You may or may not right now, but if you don't architect for it, you're going to find out the hard way that networking and service mesh and security acts differently. So you have to be careful about that. I kind of look at it as like, this is my scale of where things are neat. Who owns the stuff and who's going to take care of the thing that matters to you? So today when manageability comes in, if I'm going to go and I'm going to say just running Kubernetes on EC2, a lot of people do this. I've done this myself. Super cool, deploy is easy. However, what's the manageability? It's my fault. It's my problem now. So I have to make sure that I'm careful about that. EKS, all right, we're moving along the scale. It's a little easier to manage. And then you get into Fargate, it's fully managed. However, you also lose complete control over scaling and cost and whatnot because you don't know. It's completely obscured from you, which is kind of good, but also can be a little scary. Availability, same thing, right? Obviously, the underlying infrastructure availability handled entirely by AWS with the managed services, which is pretty attractive. Again, that's why you're going to find that EKS dominantly today for Kubernetes on infrastructure is where a lot of folks are landing. If you heard the keynote this morning, 84% of Kubernetes on the cloud is running on AWS. That's a little nutty, right? Like that was an amazing stat to hear. I'd love to get how we got to that statistic because there's another little cloud environment that may have invented Kubernetes. So it's kind of funny that they actually haven't got the dominant workloads there. And of course, performance capacity, right? So there's going to be certain things that are split. In Fargate, you have complete obscurity from it. So there's a lack of manageability and control over it. However, at the same time, you also have to think about managing it and using platforms that support that. So container configs and spec. First, you got your infrastructure. So you've already done your architecture for just the underlying infrastructure, team underlay. Next, how do you actually size your containers? How do you actually size your pods? And think about what are the specs that you assign as you look at deploying out. Making sure that those applications and the services inside them are going to be able to scale when they need to, are going to relaunch when they need to, respawning. What's the actual node got to look like, right? With some of those things, you do choose the node size, so it's going to be a performance and cost, and that's a continuous trade-off. We talked about price for performance a lot in the keynote today, too. So that's great. I can give a huge nodes, But then you're going to have issues around namespace limitations. Stuff like that can actually start to happen in large environments. That's why Kubernetes on-prem, a lot of companies have deployed on these big, they've taken their old VMware hosts and turned them into Kubernetes on bare metal. But they bump into namespace limitations because these things are so huge, it's so much memory, that they deploy all these containers and pods on them, and it literally will bump into the Linux boundaries around namespace limitations. And then the next thing first is the initial setup, but then when and what do you scale? So the scaling, again, just like this is the idea of like when is the right time, containers and pods and nodes, you set this, you set the desired state for your configuration in your application spec and your nodes, and so that initial configuration container spec is a threshold, right? The challenge with that is what's the right one? Right? Do I want to go to 60%, 75%, 80%, percentage of CPU, amount of RAM? There's a lot of different ways that you can weigh those things out. So is 12 megs right? Is 128 megs right? These are tough decisions that you kind of find out, and then of course, when you're on the cloud, what are the costs on the implications of those, especially around the node infrastructure? Like I said, EKS fully managed, but you still do choose sizing of the environment itself. Then the last thing you have to think about, and really we can go deeper into it, is what is the next layer about making sure that you know throughout that full stack what you're doing around taking the application performance requirements and understanding all of the different layers in between that can affect performance. Now, I'll quickly leave it on here because I wanted to go fast because I wanted to make sure that I can get everybody home on time and get anybody going to a good party tonight. Most importantly, that's the real good thing. All right, good parties are always going on. If you're a Turbonomic customer, I may be able to get you into one. If you're not a customer, I can make you a customer and I can get you into that party. More importantly, enjoy Las Vegas. So are there any questions about Kubernetes? I know, sorry, this is like a rapid fire kind of thing. If anybody want to put their hand up, grab a microphone. I know no one ever wants to do that, especially at the end of the day. All right, sir, we got a question. All right, now we're in real chat. I'm going to borrow the microphone.
Let me bring you the microphone because then everybody can hear your question. If you just raise your hand for me so I can find you. Okay, perfect.
That's why I like 40-minute sessions because you can actually be like legitimately interactive. Right now, you're just like, this guy talks really fast, and we go really fast.
So you were referring primarily to AWS. What about on-premise? Because a lot of the deployments on-premise.
That's a very good question. Yeah. So today, the same architectural constraints come into play. Like, do you run? I've got a lot of folks that run Kubernetes on VMs, sitting on a hypervisor, and that's kind of like I call it the gateway drug to running Kubernetes on bare metal. Because ultimately, the best performance you're going to find is running Kubernetes directly on metal. And then you've got immediate access to all those resources. There's no extra underlay that you have to deal with. However, the limitation in there is that how do you actually deploy that initial Kubernetes environment? So there's folks like RackN, a couple other deployment infrastructures that can actually do that initial push, get Kube up, and then you're ready to go. And then from that point, then you have to think about continuous management of those resources. So I prefer, if it was my choice, Kubernetes on bare metal is going to be the right choice on premises because you get the ability to truly scale up to what you need. You get the fastest access to performance. Why are VMs really neat? Because if you actually run on top of VMs, you may have deployment tools and automation scripts and things that you can put so that VMs can get spun up and then you run Kube on top. So your Kubernetes admins can have their own view of the world. And then underneath it, you've got your virtualization folks that can give them the infrastructure they need, and then it's dynamic. I used to run Kubernetes on OpenStack on Kubernetes. So I used Kubernetes to manage the OpenStack services, then ran OpenStack so I could have both Kubernetes as endpoint and an OpenStack endpoint. So again, it's a matter of who you're delivering to, who wants to consume it, and who wants to own and operate the infrastructure. The other advantage, of course, you can, like I said, VM plus Kube on one machine, so you can do side-by-side stuff. And it gets challenging around performance and making sure you're doing that. And then the last thing is security and storage and networking, right? So those three things you may find, like if you're using NSX or ACI, if you've got an SDN in place, that's where Kubernetes on a VM often is the first path, because you've already got those policies in place, and then they follow the virtual machine around. And then as you get more advanced in understanding how to integrate with Kubernetes directly, and mostly because Kubernetes is still figuring itself out, right? It's a fairly young ecosystem, so it's not like it's been around for 20 years in a large production environments. There are huge production environments, but again, so that's like, and then of course, just like operational security, physical security is usually in place on Metal or VMs anyways. But so storage, what do you do around persistent storage? It's almost inevitably already presented to some of those virtualization hosts. Again, another popular reason why you want to go kube on VM, because then you've got immediate access to that stuff, and then eventually you'll break it out and do direct access to those storage layers. And again, it's dependent on your application architecture. There's a lot of options, and the good thing is that the Kubernetes community is getting much more aggressive on embracing that we actually have persistent networking and persistent storage. Like ideally, your application should just go in, it should request not a port. It shouldn't actually care about IP. It shouldn't care about some of those persistent things. However, reality is you're probably running stuff that has straight IPv4 requirements inside the application. So we're still doing a bit of the old practices on new infrastructure. When we virtualized in the first place, we did terrible things. We did everything wrong. We virtualized giant machines. We did physical to virtual conversions. That was a fundamentally terrible idea when you think about it. But it meant that you got virtualized. So you run Kubernetes on VM, any of the Kubernetes pundits and the real sort of like diehard advocates would be like, why would you do that? Well, because I'm using Kubernetes now. And now I've got a Kubernetes endpoint. Now I'm thinking in the handle of containerization. So then when you do your next deployment, then you're going to probably move towards some on Metal, some on VM, and then same thing when you get to the cloud. It's really around how do you want to manage continuous operations of Kubernetes nodes, and what's the right choice for manageability, security, those other persistent environments. Does that cover kind of what? I know it's like, it depends. Like that's the worst IT answer. Like it depends on like 17 factors. But again, like I would be happy to even introduce you to other folks that are running scale similar to what you're looking at. And so if you do come by the booth, or I'll give you my card as well, I'm happy to help anybody connect with folks that are running Kubernetes in real production environments and can help answer some of these questions if I can't answer them directly myself. The beauty part about open communities and open ecosystems is we're all here to help each other succeed. Sadly, this is powered by sponsorship. So I got to do the 48 seconds where I'm going to talk about Turbonomic. I will encourage you, if you want to find out more about how Turbonomic can work, I would come on over to the booth. But bear with me for this moment. This is actually a quick video inside our user interface, and I'll show you what we do around performance when I talk about the context. We actually go in without agents, and we understand from the applications all the way down through the different infrastructure, whether it's Kubernetes, whether it's just straight containers, whether it's all the way down on cloud, on bare metal. And so the idea is we're able to take business applications and virtual applications, like application servers like Java, SQL, et cetera, and understand real application level requirements and metrics like heap and database memory. Again, understanding what are the requirements on containers. Remember I said, when do you scale a container? Well, maybe you want to scale out on the container. Maybe you need to scale the pod itself. So what we do is we're actually able to take that understanding of that whole stack of applications and not just tell you what you should do, but actually take those actions for you and give you very prescriptive, God, that's hard to say at the end of the day, specific actions. So it's going to be whether you scale the VM in order to meet the needs of those pods that are running on top of it, or scale EKS itself. Because you may have deployed EKS based on what your requirements were that day. What happens when you actually go further, right? If you're doing stuff like you're running VMware Kubernetes or PKS or OpenShift, whatever it's going to be, those decisions may not be right in a month or a year. So being able to understand not only the performance, but the cost, to say like, as I make these decisions, we can probably scale back, we can deliver the same performance on less nodes and ultimately save some of the money for the company. We can do a lot of different ways that we can affect things. So we can do a lot of neat stuff around that. That's the end of the Turbo Talk. Mostly it's all about Kubernetes. It's all about having fun together. And if you do want to connect, The easiest way to find me is on Twitter. I'm at Disco Posse. Don't ask, it's a long story. But has this been helpful? Has this been, if anything, it's been fun, I hope. But I do very much thank you for taking the time with us today. I've got 23 seconds to go. I will use that kindly to say thank you to all the folks. So big hand for all the folks that actually make this stuff happen. This is incredible. These are the unsung heroes of the environment that make this entire world work. So people do be safe, hydrate well, have a great time. Like I said, we're over at the Turbonomic booth. I'll stay around. They are actually going to kick all of us out. The lights will go down in a few minutes, and they'll kick us out. But do come by if you want tomorrow and connect. Like I said, I can give you a card. I'm happy to have a longer chat with anybody, and we can get deeper on what we talked about today. Again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Eric. And again, their booth is 1029 if anyone wants to check it out. We thank you for coming, and we'll be back here tomorrow with some more great speakers. Hope to see you here.